we've got diabetes as like the 8th leading cause of death of Americans. 1 in 3 have prediabetes, 1 in 10 have diabetes. So when we're talking about chronic disease and chronic inflammation or neuroinflammation, like we have to almost really start with metabolic health and what's kind of the primary mechanism of metabolic health and energy homeostasis. It's glucose regulation.
Hey friends, welcome back to the Unlock the Sugar Shackles podcast. I am so thankful that you are here for another episode. Thank you for coming back week after week, rating, subscribing, reviewing, leaving comments. I really, really, really appreciate it. And I'm so excited to bring you today's interview with a new guest, Brendan Vermeire. Brendan has tons and tons of certifications. He is super, super knowledgeable. I have left his whole entire bio in the description in the show notes. And if you want to find him, you could find him at metabolicsolutions.llc.com or The Holistic Savage on Instagram. And in today's episode, we talk all about brain health. And we're talking about, are you someone who struggles with anxiety, depression, OCD, ADHD, memory loss, brain fog? All of these things are so tied to our blood sugar and metabolic health. It's really crazy how our mental health can really be so impacted by our metabolic health, but it gives us so much more to work with. It to me, knowing that our mental health is really just a manifestation of our metabolic health and our blood sugar, it gives us so much more control over it. So in today's episode, we talk about how Alzheimer's is now being called type 3 diabetes. We talk about oxidative stress and inflammation and all these different things that can start impacting our brain, how our blood sugar is tied in. And then we talk about some holistic approaches to reduce that neuroinflammation that we may be struggling with. So I'm so excited to dive into the interview. And before that, I just want to thank today's sponsor for the episode, Good Idea, which is a sparkling water that helps to lower our blood sugar response from meals by 20 to 30%. You drink 1/3 of the can before the meal and the rest of the can with the meal, and that's it. That's all you have to do to lower the blood sugar response by about 25% at every meal. And this is great to take with you if you can't control the menu somewhere. So at a dinner party, or you're going to the beach or to a picnic, or where you're going to be around foods that are not going to be the most blood sugar friendly. So such a great tool to help keep that blood sugar stable, help our mental health. And so you can go to goodidea.us and use the code DannyHealth to get 10% off of your first order at goodidea.us. All right, everyone, let's dive into today's interview with Brendan Vermeire. Brendan, I'm so excited to welcome you to the Unlock the Sugar Shackles podcast.
Thanks for having me, Danielle. It's nice to meet you face to face in the virtual realm, and I can't believe we haven't met in the flesh, but I'm sure it's just a matter of time. I think it's inevitable, but thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. We definitely know a lot of the same people, and I love the content that you put out on Instagram. That's where I originally came across your work, and you talk a lot about some really cool topics, a lot about the brain, metabolic health, and all things that I feel really interested in, and I think that my people will be really interested in as well. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about you and how you came into doing what you do today and what you're passionate about. So let's start there.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of your work as well. I think blood sugar dysregulation, as I'm sure we'll get into, it is one of the biggest threats to at least American health, and obviously it's spreading across the globe as modernization kind of does its thing. And I'll be looking forward to getting to know you and your work when I have you on my podcast. We'll do a part 2. But yeah, my origin story, it's a long, painful story, but I've gotten good at just succinctly giving some cliff notes, because my background is fitness nutrition. And while I really heavily operate in the functional medicine space and kind of deep in the functional medicine space, I still bring that nutrition, fitness, and really just metabolic health background to it. And while, my whole platform is very mental health specific, a lot of talking about neuroinflammation, neuroplasticity, and what can alter those physiological mechanisms. And I strategically sort of branded and niched that way because it gave me an excuse of, something I'm really, really passionate about with mental health, but I'm using every bit of knowledge that I've accumulated through my own healing journey and my career path. And, I bring that metabolic component to it and the gut-brain axis, and also a very heavy kind of mindset and psychology base as well. So it really is kind of its own sort of hybridized approach to mental health, functional mental health, and my whole branding. But having started my career as a trainer and nutrition coach, that then was really struggling with my mental health, and actually had a intentional overdose and suicide attempt that landed me, breathing out of a tube in the ICU and going through psychiatric wards where you're, locked up and fed pills to try to stabilize you before they, release you back into society, and being in, a toxic relationship that had a lot of elements to it with trauma and maybe mold illness, and ended up, resulting in a lot of, betrayal and toxicity. And she ended up taking her life years after we had separated. So, these are like some dramatic cliff notes that is painting this vague picture that I'm really just trying to use to say, like, I got on this path where I was very obsessed with like deep metabolic physiology and biochemistry. I was not the personal trainer nutrition guy I wasn't really interested or passionate about like taking people through workouts or trying to teach them, eating habits. Like, that felt very just basic and redundant, not very exciting for me. I really liked, the metabolic testing with like VO2 and resting metabolic rate, and the blood work and functional lab testing. And I liked the data, I liked the research, and I liked using that to build more sophisticated, healing programs, fitness, nutrition programs. So then as I, was trying to save my ex-fiance from her mysterious illnesses, that's kind of what steered me more into root cause medicine. And then, of course, trying to figure out how to overcome my own mental health diagnoses of ADHD and major depressive disorder. So somehow, through that journey, it's like I got to where I am today, like some 13 years later, where, I've kind of established myself as the dude for this stuff. But I'm super excited for this conversation. I had a great conversation with your friend, Molly, about my expertise and how it relates to sleep. But what you're doing with blood sugar, which is just so huge. I mean, we've got diabetes as like the 8th leading cause of death of Americans. 1 in 3 have prediabetes. 1 in 10 have diabetes. So when we're talking about chronic disease and chronic inflammation or neuroinflammation, like, we have to almost really start with metabolic health and what's kind of the primary mechanism of metabolic health and energy. What happened during that time? I found myself back in front of the same doctor. And so then this time it was like, well, the sertraline didn't work, so now let's do Wellbutrin, so a dopamine drug. And then I got the referral to a clinical psychiatry clinic, underwent, formal psychiatric evaluation, which was mostly just subjective questionnaires. Again, no lab testing, which I'm making that point for a reason, because I like objectivity. I like looking at what is going on physiologically, not just subjectively, like how do they present from a behavior psychology perspective, and, treating it that way. But either way, that's when I got the diagnostic labels of ADHD and major depressive disorder. And ironically, I wasn't doing great. I'll admit that. I had joined the Navy after high school for the SEAL program. That was like my life goal at the time. And I was medically discharged from training while in boot camp because I had a pre-existing injury, which means it's not their problem. So they just get rid of you, medical discharge. So I wasn't doing great. And I was starting my career as a fitness and nutrition professional. And I was just kind of going through those early 20s turbulence. I think I was kind of like high functioning depressive at that point. And then, without going into all the detail, I found myself in a toxic relational situation where I got betrayed, and that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And it was just one of those like fuck it moments. And then you swallow a bottle of pills and wake up in the hospital like 3 days later. So that's like the undertoned version of it.
Yeah. So how does neuroinflammation come into play with your story? or does it?
Yeah, no, I mean, all that's a great question because obviously my whole platform really centers around the concepts of neuroinflammation, neuroplasticity as regulated by microglial cells. And I think a lot of people misunderstand my work. We can't say that neuroinflammation is the singular cause of all mental health struggles. That is not true. Right. What we can say is neuroinflammation is implicated in virtually every neurodevelopmental disorder, mental health disorder, and neurodegenerative condition. So the way to be thinking about it, and I have a beautiful slide in my program that teaches this more, eloquently, but essentially it's like you have to be thinking about, we all have our unique genome, our unique genetics, even though we're like 99.9% genetically identical, all of us, but that, 0.01% is really what gives us our unique traits, why you and I don't look alike or sound alike. And so that gives us our predisposition to our nature, our aura, our cognitive functionality, our personality, so on and so forth. And so the way I like to explain is, we have no control over our genetics, but obviously, as I'm sure you and your whole audience can appreciate, we have a lot of control over our epigenetic expression and changing the input signals that our genes are receiving to create a different epigenetic phenotype. So essentially, whether you have let's say 10 people, this one's genetically predisposed to autism, this one is genetically predisposed to bipolar, this one is genetically predisposed to ADHD, so on and so forth. So what happens if you light their genes on fire? What happens if you insinuate and ignite, inflammation and oxidative stress in those bodies? Whatever their predisposition is, it's going to make it worse, right? Oxidative stress and inflammation are really the two great plagues of the human condition. Give me any condition, any disease that does not have oxidative stress and inflammation as part of the pathophysiological mechanism. I don't think there is one. I don't know, but I don't think there is one. So my point being, regardless of what mental health struggles or diagnoses you might be predisposed to, as soon as you start increasing inflammation and oxidative stress in the body and the brain, it's going to exacerbate all of that, right? So it's going to decrease the functionality if you're autistic. It's going to decrease your functionality if you're ADHD. It makes the symptoms louder. So this is where a lot of my work really centers around, modulating what we call the cytokine and chemokine milieu of the central nervous system. You think about what's your brain going to be doing if it's marinating in a bunch of pro-inflammatory cytokines and oxidative molecules. It's going to burn up and degenerate over time, and you're probably going to act unstable, unhinged, maybe kind of crazy, and it's going to burn up. So a lot of what we see in America's population now is more of a pre-dementia. They're essentially on the physiological track towards neurodegeneration. It's this low-level chronic neuroinflammatory process that's going on in their brain, but it presents as the anxiety, the insomnia, the brain fog, the ADHD, or exacerbating, bipolar mania, whatever it is. So, it's complicated, but that's kind of at the crux of it, what's going on.
Wow. So just to sum up in simple terms, this oxidative stress and inflammation, can you break that down into simple forms and tell us why is that so bad? You mentioned lighting the brain on fire and making the symptoms louder, to an audience who's never opened a biology book in years. Can you explain why this is so bad and why it makes all these diseases so much worse?
Oh, absolutely. So I always like to use the analogy of we have a beautiful forest. I think of Portland for some reason because it's so lush and green up there during the spring and summer, right? So it's you have this forest, you have this beautiful ecosystem. So whereas neuroplasticity and neurogenesis is more thinking about the trees and the plants all growing and thriving, the interconnectedness of all the root systems, we develop this canopy of just green lush, this dense forest, right? So that's more, tissue generation, proliferation, neurogenesis, which actually this art piece right here is called neurogenesis. We have a brain up here and some neurons growing. But anyways, the whole point being, it's your brain is made up of a bunch of tissues and cell types, just like every other part of your body. And so we want that lush green foliage that's just continuing to proliferate and grow. Now, obviously, we're always going to have some tissue turnover, right? You know, a tree dies, it falls over, the fungus is going to eat it and recycle its nutrients back to the soil, so new life can grow. Now, if you think about physiologically regulated inflammation as, you know, a farmer that's going to like burn his field, or maybe there's like a patch of the forest that's kind of dead and decaying, and it would be healthier for the forest and the ecosystem to just go ahead and like start a fire and burn this chunk of the forest off, so it's recycling those nutrients back to the soil so new life can grow through. So that's like your acute inflammation. That's physiologically regulated inflammation. Obviously, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, chronic inflammation equals chronic disease. Inflammation is bad. It's like, well, no, I mean, inflammation is the cleansing fire that your body uses to fight off pathogens, to remodel tissues so that new tissues can grow and thrive. But then we have that out of control forest fire, right? You know, if the environmental conditions are, you know, dysfunctional, I guess you could say, and a fire starts, if there's not that physiological regulation to keep it in check, let's only keep it in this part of the forest. If it gets out of control, right, it's going to start spreading and burning the whole forest down. So that's kind of a good analogy for like that chronic inflammation. You know, a lot of people are sort of cooking in their bodies long term because of the toxic environment, sedentary lifestyle, the diet, you know, just the whole standard American lifestyle. And oxidative stress is kind of like the shadow of inflammation in a way. So I just use the analogy of like an iron bar that's rusting outside. You know, that's what's happening, is the iron is reacting with the oxygen and oxidizing, and it's rusting, it's disintegrating. So you can kind of think of that oxidative stress as like almost like a rusting of your cells internally. So if you've got like that fire that's burning and that rusting effect, everything's going to get worse. And this is part of inflammaging. You know, we do age, like why do we get withered and gray? It's inflammaging. It's inflammation that is essentially creeping up as our immune system gets old and tired, and it can't regulate that anymore. So that fire just kind of burns us out over time. So we're aging faster. So we could have a whole conversation around anti-aging medicine because it's built on the same principles.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I think really powerful to have that really great analogy that you shared of that there's this runaway fire inside that is burning up, and then you're rusting. So that is what is happening to your cells as there is this inflammation and the oxidative stress. And as it's kind of obvious now to see, oh yeah, that would definitely make everything worse, right? Mm-hmm. So tell us what role our blood sugar has when it comes to neuroinflammation. How are the two linked? Like, what does our blood sugar do when it comes to, like, or how does it cause neuroinflammation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really cool, very direct effect. I mean, obviously glucose being the primary fuel source of the body, or at least, you know, kind of the preferred fuel source. And sure, we could have the whole, you know, ketosis conversation, metabolic flexibility. But at the end of the day, especially for your brain tissue and your neurons that really prefer glucose. And yes, they can use ketone bodies as a backup fuel source. And yes, ketones have, you know, great neurological kind of anti-neuroinflammatory benefits. But really, with inflammation and insulin resistance and hyperglycemia, with hyperglycemia, it's very damaging to the body, very toxic. It causes glucotoxicity, as I'm sure you're aware, and then lipotoxicity, because then we get into this dyslipidemia, hyperglycemia. So we have, you know, high lipid values like your triglycerides and cholesterol and whatever, but also high levels of the blood sugar and advanced glycation end products, as they're called, that are very damaging and oxidizing and pro-inflammatory. And it kind of gets into this vicious cycle because inflammation drives insulin resistance, but then insulin resistance drives more inflammation. And this is where I'm sure, you know, some of your audience, and you've probably seen, you know, some people are starting to call Alzheimer's a type 3 diabetes, because one of the physiological characteristics of Alzheimer's is the brain cells themselves are becoming insulin resistant. Now, I don't know that we should call it a type 3 diabetes necessarily, because there's other things that can cause that effect. But yeah, the brain cells becoming insulin resistant is a part of that. So that glucotoxicity drives a lot of inflammation and oxidative stress in the body. and the brain and activates the glial system of the brain, which causes more, brain on fire, if you will. And so it becomes this vicious cycle, but also without proper effective insulin and IGF-1 signaling, we can't heal our brain. If we can't get fuel, aka sugar, into the brain cells because they're insulin resistant, and there's this hyperglycemic, oxidative inflammatory milieu, it just sets us up into this sort of perpetuating cycle. So I do think, whether it's Alzheimer's or diabetes or anxiety, just making sure that all of our clients and patients are regulating their blood sugar effectively, it's arguably like public enemy number one.
Yeah, so it sounds, just so for people who are not familiar with some of those terms that you use, like advanced glycation end products, can you talk about that in just super simple terms for to make it easy to understand?
Yeah, ultimately, we're supposed to be able to ingest sugar, absorb it well, get into the cells, burn it in the mitochondria through glycolysis and the citric acid cycle and all that to produce cellular energy. But when there's this dysregulated insulin signaling, we get more pro-inflammatory cytokines, more free radicals that are the oxidative molecules that drive that rusting effect, and then also these advanced glycation end products, which is kind of like basically sugar reacting with other proteins that causes these noxious little molecules, these naughty little molecules that start doing damage to the body and contribute to that fire and rusting effect.
Awesome. Yeah. So having high blood sugar over time is contributing to this whole fire and rusting storm that we were talking about. So lowering if you have high blood sugar, lowering the blood sugar, reducing the spikes is really, really important. So, some people are like, oh, I don't have to care about blood sugar spikes because I'm not diabetic. But each time you spike your blood sugar, you are getting this release of these pro-inflammatory molecules. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So then you think about, how much, because obviously, blood sugar dysregulation is huge spectrum, like severe insulin resistance versus just more mild dysregulation, or some people are on a roller coaster. But you think about how many millions and millions of Americans are spending, the majority of their day-to-day time in this kind of chronic hyperglycemic state. And, this is where, whether it's the continuous glucose monitors and regular blood work with HbA1c and insulin and C-peptide and fasting glucose, like those basic biomarkers, we got to get them in check by whatever, intervention is necessary.
Right. Absolutely. So, how does cortisol come into play when it comes to our blood sugar and neuroinflammation?
Yeah, stress being one of the big culprits in the world and in America today, I think that HPA axis, adrenal sympathetic tone overload that so many people have, that chronic cortisol response, because with our blood sugar regulation, it's like, we have this one hormone that lowers blood sugar, which is insulin, versus, we've got the cortisol and the glucagon and the human growth hormone, multiple hormones that drive up blood sugar. And taking out some of those others, we really have this sort of tug of war between insulin and cortisol. And you need harmony with that. So anytime I'm, working with a client or whatever, like we always want to make sure we're evaluating the adrenal status and their cortisol levels and in relation to that insulin. The majority of the demographic that I work with, most of these people, like they already have a very healthy foundational lifestyle. So I don't get as many, just like pure insulin resistance, hyperglycemic. Most of my people, they're on kind of this blood sugar roller coaster. It's more of a dysregulation. So, maybe their insulin levels in relation to their cortisol is having them, on that hyperglycemic, hypoglycemic kind of roller coaster. So we have to sort of stabilize that out. We need stable blood sugar to function and feel good throughout the day.
Yeah. Do you see a lot of people who struggle with low blood sugar or these blood sugar lows and having the cortisol dysregulation or other issues maybe at the root of it?
Yeah, the demographic I tracked, that's more so what I see. We were talking off air about some of the, POTS or mold or, kind of infectious immunological things. Mold is probably the primary sort of demographic I've worked with for the past like 6 years. So there is a lot of that. There's a lot of these kind of gut-brain axis, HPA axis issues that then are dysregulating the blood sugar. So you do see a lot of like, reactive hypoglycemia, like you had mentioned off air, and people just have this imbalanced push-pull between their blood sugar regulating hormones.
Yeah, so you work a lot with people with mold exposure. What kinds of symptoms might you see or might you want to look for if you think that you might have mold?
Mold, it's such a huge subject to unpack, and there's so much information out there now. And so I will say, like, in my practice, it's kind of 50-50 where, like, I get a lot of people coming to me thinking they have mold, and it's kind of 50-50 of, like, half of them, they actually do have, evidence of more of, like, a mold-induced illness or mycotoxicosis or something. Whereas the other 50%, it's more like they've been scared into believing they think they might have mold, and then they really don't. It's like they're freaking out because they saw a little bit of mold in their windowsill and like, oh, but I'm anxious, so maybe the mold is causing my anxiety. So this is where, using testing and clinical evaluation to really determine, is this a relevant issue for you? Because if it's not, we don't want to go down that rabbit hole. And if it is, we need to address it. But part of what can make mold so tricky is it can present as just about anything. Now, the more severe mold cases are going to present much more as like chronic fatigue and depression and neurological symptoms, and usually a lot of GI stuff too, IBS, IBD kind of stuff. So when I see somebody that's like, they have weird neurological things going on, like numbness and tingling and peripheral neuropathy, debilitating, fatigue or depression, or because obviously anything neurological is then going to obviously impact mood very directly and just their demeanor. A lot of musculoskeletal pain, increased urination, IBS, IBD kind of symptoms. So if I see a case like that where we have all these different clusters of symptoms, I'm going to be a little bit more suspicious about the mold, as opposed to somebody that, just has more moderate anxiety, but they're not presenting with some of these more systemic, organ system dysfunction presentations. But, just doing a lot of testing and blood work can delineate what's going on there.
Gotcha. I actually spoke with a client today who she presents with reactive hypoglycemia, and she said that it started 4 years ago after a concussion. So, being a neuro expert, what would you maybe suppose is sort of impacting that?
Yeah, I mean, if I had to guess, with concussion or TBI, which I don't post about those subjects much, but whereas, you think about mold or hyperglycemia, that can contribute to the activation of what's called the glial system or the immune system of the brain. And it's really that system that regulates the neuroinflammatory process. Something like a direct head injury, it's a little bit more obvious. It's a little more intuitive because it's a direct physiological, tissue burden and injury, and it has the same effect though. So, I mean, you can think about that neuroinflammatory process. It could be more activated from more of like an endogenous sort of chemical thing, if you will, or whereas just a straight up head injury, whether you get dropped on your head, which this is kind of relevant to my sad story because my ex-fiance was a cheerleader and did, flying, stunting. So she was the one getting thrown up in the air, and she did. She got dropped on her head numerous times, had numerous severe concussions, and she had, unresolved childhood trauma, and we were living in what was a pretty water-damaged, moldy house. So it was kind of that perfect storm. But my point being, concussion or TBI, it does cause a direct insult to the brain and it stirs up what we call damage-associated molecular patterns, which are basically just damaged debris from the tissues that are being damaged, and that triggers the glial system or the immune system of the brain to activate, to try to remodel those tissues and, use that cleansing fire to clean things up. But it does create this vicious cycle of neuroinflammation that then could cause a lot of dysregulation downstream. A lot of neuro experts kind of like to argue, it's like, well, it all starts with the brain. So, if there is like this neuroinflammatory process in the brain, your vagal tone goes out, your gut goes out, your blood sugar regulation goes out, your HPA axis goes off. So yeah, that could be a very real thing, is a concussion then is presenting as, something like reactive hypoglycemia down the road.
Yeah. Thank you for that explanation. So in addition to brain trauma, blood sugar, cortisol, what are some other things that drive neuroinflammation?
Yeah. I have a nice little graphic on social that people can check out, because it's almost like what doesn't drive neuroinflammation. And I think some of the people that troll me online, it's like, okay, so everything can cause neuroinflammation. It's like, well, I mean, kind of, but the dose makes the poison, right? That's where we have to be thinking about physiology and biochemistry as a highly dynamic process that's in constant flux. So I always like to be talking in terms of, the inflammatory load is kind of the term that I like to use, because it's like, how many logs are you throwing on the fire of inflammation, right? Like, the healthier you are, the less gasoline and logs you're dumping onto that fire, which means the fire is going to kind of die and go out, right? But, all it takes is, let's say you're a healthy person, like, and I'm not trying to be like ableist or something right now, but like, you and I, we walk the walk, we talk the talk, we practice what we preach, we live a very health promoting lifestyle. But if I went out tonight and I'm like, all right, I stay up late, I drink like 5 alcoholic beverages, and, let's say I eat some glutinous pizza and, whatever, think about all of those harmful input signals that contribute to a bit of inflammation. Now, so if I keep doing that, every week, and I'm living that lifestyle every day, so my point being, we have to be thinking in terms of input signals, right? Like even, I just went and got a vaccine. That's an input signal that's going to activate inflammation and oxidative stress. Like, you can document it if you do your blood work pre and post, right? So whether it's, more like naughty pathogens, viruses, fungi, bacteria, parasites, so on and so forth, heavy metals, environmental toxicants like the bisphenols and glyphosate, stress being a big one, gut issues, concussion, pro-inflammatory diet. It's like the list goes on and on and on, which is why I like to take a very holistic approach, because the point isn't I'm trying to like scare everybody of like everything increases neuroinflammation, but we have to analyze like, okay, this individual, what are they struggling with? What is going on in their bodies based on the lab testing? And what are the harmful input signals that they're receiving, which is why I think your show and your platform is so cool, because the hyperglycemia is such a major and widely prevalent input signal that millions of Americans have, that is directly feeding that fire in the body and the brain.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the other hand, what are some practices, lifestyle strategies, and things that we can do to start? And you mentioned this is very holistic. So what are some of those things that we can start to do to reduce the inflammation in the brain, reduce the wildfire and rusting situation we have?
Absolutely. I mean, I look at it as my job and goal to really educate, empower people, to give them options. And personally, I'm the kind of guy, especially since I'm not a licensed medical provider and I don't pretend to be, I can't fix it for you. All I can do is educate, empower, and guide you on how you can fix it yourself. So I like to present, it's like, okay, what are the psychological healing opportunities, the physiological, and what intervention is going to resonate with them? The client or the patient, I'm big on positive psychology and motivational interviewing, because the intervention has to resonate with the client, right? And I will say, these days there's a growing anti-pharmaceutical sentiment, and I understand why. But personally, I don't care what the intervention is, as long as it works, it resonates with them, they're going to comply with it, they're going to do it consistently, and it gets the job done, right? So we can open up this whole conversation on like, great, what are the pharmaceutical options that are relevant here, whether it's, your metformin or Ozempic or whatever you want to do. Okay, you don't want to do drugs or whatever. okay, what supplements are relevant, what lifestyle changes with nutrition, exercise, which I want to say, like, nutrition and exercise would fix like 85% of the problems when well, sort of prescribed and conducted. The sleep hygiene that Molly can, riff on, or the stress management, the time in nature, the meaningful relationships. So I like to be taking that more holistic approach where it's a combination of, like, when you have a client or patient that's really unwell, I think you should be working as close to the source of dysfunction as possible, right? So if they're diabetic, like, maybe they do take Ozempic or metformin or something with some berberine and alpha lipoic acid as a supplement. But let's not stop there. Like, let's get you moving, let's get you exercising, let's get you sleeping, let's get you managing the stress, let's work on your psychology. So all the above. But I do want to just make sure we delineate, because sometimes in the holistic realm, we're working too holistically. Because it's like, you can jump on the trendy bandwagon of sitting in cold water. That's probably not going to drop your insulin levels by, 10 points, which it might need to do very quickly. So, it is that, like, let's work on the primary dysfunction, but also work on holistically optimizing the overall picture.
Right. So I think what I'm hearing you say is that you can't biohack your way out of a poorly designed lifestyle where your habits are really dialed in. And is that it?
Yeah, I mean, you can't, supplement or medicate or biohack your way out of a lifestyle-induced illness. So especially when we're talking about type 2 diabetes, which is purely, yes, there's genetic predisposition, sure. But, it's lifestyle induced. So shouldn't we be using lifestyle as the primary intervention? I had a client back in the day. I was like 18 years old, maybe 19. I'm a young, new, green trainer and nutrition coach. And I had this client who was able to get her personal training with me covered by insurance because she had been diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. And it's like, well, what's the medical treatment for metabolic syndrome? Like, there isn't really any. Like, sure, there's drugs, but it's lifestyle. So she was able to have insurance pay for her training, which that kind of like, yeah, I didn't even know that was a thing back then. I'm like, all right, let me talk to my boss and make sure that we can run that. But that was a thing. So yeah, lifestyle medicine for the win.
Yeah, that's awesome. I did a whole podcast on the fact that I found out that metabolic syndrome used to be called insulin resistance syndrome. And I'm like, why don't they call it that anymore? Like, they should be calling it, I feel like metabolic syndrome, maybe it's more technically accurate or whatever it is, but it feels so vague, right? Like, to me, and like, before maybe you knew what you knew now, like, metabolic syndrome, what does that mean? I think the average person is thinking you have a slow metabolism, right?
Yeah.
Like, it just feels so difficult to assess. It's like, what do you do if you have metabolic syndrome? I have a slow metabolism. What do I do? Like, people think that that's like ingrained in them, right? So if we say insulin resistance syndrome, it might have them say, like, well, what's insulin? What's my insulin levels doing? It might foster that, check into, like, oh, maybe I should check what my insulin's doing, which doctors don't even look at, and they refuse to sometimes, even if you ask them. So that's just my, like, soapbox about why on earth do they call it that?
No, it's true. I love specificity over ambiguity. And it's like, in the beginning of my career, obviously as a nutrition fitness guy working at, a nice bougie corporate health club, the vast majority of my clients, they're just like regular American people that are like, a bit overweight and out of shape, and they're just trying to lose some weight, get healthier. And some of them a little bit more overweight, some of them obese, right? And what really got me on it, I mean, the company I worked for was very science-based, which was great. But, like, okay, great, Danielle, you want to lose 50 pounds in the next 6 months. How are you wanting to measure progress along the journey? Well, I'll just weigh myself on the scale every day. And then if I don't lose a pound in a week, you're fired as a trainer because you suck, right? So it's like trying to avoid that. So it's like, okay, no. We're not going to use body weight as a good sensitive means of how you're objectively improving your health. Let's measure your resting metabolic rate. Speaking of slow metabolism, let's measure your max VO2 to see how cardiovascularly, fit you are. Let's do a fitness assessment. Let's do some blood work, because I guarantee you that, your fasting glucose, your insulin, your HbA1c, your triglycerides, your liver enzymes, like your leptin levels, adiponectin, all of these things are going to change long before you're going to see a difference in the mirror or feel a difference in your clothes, right? Yeah. And especially when you're trying to like hack the neurolimbic system, you have to give your neurolimbic system that input signal that says we are making progress, therefore I should keep doing this behavior, right? Our brain has evolved like path of least resistance. Yeah. We want to conserve our energy. So if we're working so hard for a goal and it doesn't feel or seem like we're getting closer to that goal, your brain's going to be like, stop doing it. Stop going to the gym. Stop restricting your diet. It's not getting you closer to where you're trying to get. So that's why I'm just so passionate about that sensitive data, because then we can show people like, look, your resting metabolic rate went up by 500 calories. Your VO2 went up by 10 points. Your insulin dropped in half, then you can objectively prove to them that the intervention that is nutrition, fitness, lifestyle, it's working. So let's keep going.
Yeah, I love that. That's such great points. And what I do with a lot of my clients in my blood sugar mastery program, we have a symptom questionnaire and people will rate their symptoms, and it's fully subjective. But after a couple of weeks, they rate them again and all their symptoms come down, and they might be like, well, I haven't lost weight yet. It's like your body was a little busy. A lot of things were happening. So it's really helpful for people to see, and that's a subjective data. And then, of course, you're talking about all these objective things that you can look at. A lot of us look at the CGM data, like, oh my goodness, it looked like a mountain range before I started, and now it's like a little squiggly line, right? And so that's what we want to start to see. And tell me more about how you measure resting metabolic rate, and like, what does that look like? Why don't I know about this?
It's a really great technology. It's crazy how like back in the day, 13 years ago, I was getting exposed to things that I didn't realize how sort of like novel and new they were for sort of the space, the idea of like knuckle dragging fitness trainers using blood work as part of their fitness, like that wasn't a thing. And that's where I'll just give the company credit, Lifetime Fitness. Like they did an amazing job of having a very kind of like clinical nutrition, functional medicine mixed with fitness nutrition. They just did a great job with it. So the metabolic testing, I've been really passionate about since the beginning of my career. So I used to conduct this testing, and actually I just got contacted by a company on Instagram that they sell the equipment, and you can buy this and learn how to do it. But essentially you have your client or patient wear this mask over their nose and mouth, so you're sealing off their respiratory chambers, and you're just measuring their O2 CO2 exchange rate. That's all that's going on. These tubes that are hooked up to the mask, it's just hooked up to a machine that's measuring gas exchange. So we can measure, how much oxygen are they breathing in, how much CO2 are they breathing out, and that ratio is known as the respiratory quotient, which is reflective of basically how effectively is your body's 30 trillion cells using that oxygen in order to create ATP, and then obviously exhaling the gaseous waste product that is CO2. So we can have you like laying in a chair in sort of like a sedative mode for, about 30, 60 minutes. And we're just measuring your breathing along with your heart rate. And essentially, let's say we conduct like a 30-minute test and we see, your oxygen consumption in 30 minutes at rest. We take that data and basically stretch it over a 24-hour period. And essentially the idea is like, okay, if you're using this much oxygen in 30 minutes, that means you're using this much oxygen in 24 hours at rest, which would be the equivalent of burning this many calories at rest. So it's a calculation of the resting metabolic rate, which is the closest thing we can do to get as close to the basal metabolic rate as possible. Basal metabolic rate being just if you were in a coma for 24 hours, how many calories is your body going to burn for basic metabolic functioning while you're completely out of it, right?
Right.
But having that resting metabolic rate was always really eye-opening for clients, because as we get them more fit and healthy, your resting metabolic rate goes up. As we pack on muscle, which is a very energy expensive tissue, your resting metabolic rate goes up, your metabolism speeds up, if you will. And it was really cool too, because with that we could see, based on the respiratory quotient, are you mostly burning carbohydrate or are you really good at burning fat? So this is kind of opening up that conversation around metabolic flexibility or inflexibility, right? So it's like, well, you're very sugar adapted. You're really just kind of burning through sugar, and your body's not really good at tapping into its stored body fat. So we need to shift your metabolism to be better at utilizing fat, both at rest and during exercise. So it's really cool technology that can be pretty empowering and enlightening.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really cool. And so just as a review, or for people who are hearing this for the first time, what are the benefits of being able to burn body fat for fuel instead of being fully dependent on just burning sugar?
Yeah, well, I mean, you think about what we can store, like 200 grams of sugar in the liver as glycogen, and maybe like another 200, 300, 400, depending on your muscle mass, and skeletal muscle. But as you and a lot of your audience knows, we can't liberate sugar from your muscles back into the bloodstream. Like once sugar gets into your muscles, it stays there, it's stored there, it's burned there locally. So we're really kind of left with the liver to regulate how much sugar is floating around in the blood. So just my point being, we did not evolve to rely on sugar as our main fuel source. We have a very, very limited capacity to store sugar in the body, whereas body fat, adipocytes, like there's really no limit to how much energy, chemical energy you can store as triglycerides in your fat cells, right? And especially, with what is it, like 70% of Americans being overweight or obese, and everybody's trying to, lose weight, lose body fat. It's like, well, you got to be able to tap into the body fat and burn the body fat if you want to lose it, right? So that was kind of a huge teaching point that I used to really kind of enthrall my clients. And I always like to use like science to get them more interested in their training program, because if I could explain it in a way that's scientifically accurate but empowering for them, of like, wait, so the reason why I'm not losing weight, I'm not good at burning body fat. Well, how do I get my body good at burning fat, right? So it became this sort of metabolic shift kind of coaching approach that helps them a lot. And then when we can measure it and get their metabolism working in their favor, kind of working smarter, not harder, right? A lot of people can appreciate that.
Yeah, that's awesome. So Brendan, where can people find you to learn more, and what sort of services do you offer?
Yeah, no, thanks. I'm not hard to find on Instagram. It's The Holistic Savage. That's my main platform. And of course, we have a website, metabolicsolutionsllc.com. But honestly, my link tree is where all my most important links live. I feel like websites are irrelevant anymore. But,
everything's a link tree.
Exactly. People can follow along on Instagram. It's where I share all the free content, explore my resources. We do work with private clients. We train practitioners and kind of do everything in between.
Awesome. Very, very cool. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your knowledge and wisdom and helping us learn all about why we want to keep down that neuroinflammation. It has these far-reaching effects. I feel like I like how you were talking about at the beginning, how under the umbrella of neuroinflammation, you can basically talk about anything you can, and same thing with blood sugar, because it's this like hub and all these things relate to it. And so, we can talk about the brain and how that is linked with our blood sugar. We can talk about sleep and how that's linked with the other, so it's really cool because for anybody to be well, you need to do all the things, like a lot of things in a lot of different areas. As you were talking about with the holistic way to approach neuroinflammation, same thing. It's like, wouldn't you know that optimizing the time that you go to sleep and your circadian rhythm and dialing in your diet and movement and getting outside in the sun, that's not only good for your blood sugar, but it's also good for your brain. And so there's so much overlap in all the things that we do, because it comes down to those core foundational principles of how you design your lifestyle. So I'm sure you are helping people with that in your programs as well as I am. And that can be the tricky thing. It's like, how do I make this lifestyle work with not giving up everything I love and not isolating myself and, living off the grid? It's like, how do we make it work functionally in our modern world? And I think that's what we a lot of what we do is to bridge that gap for our clients. So thank you so much again for being here, and I will link all your notes in the show notes, and we'll have to have you on again to do some more deep dives.
That sounds great. Thank you, Danielle.
Awesome. Thank you.